Hello and welcome back. Tonight, we are joined by journalist Joshua Collins for a deep dive on Colombia. I know you guys saw us cover it a little bit, but I really wanted to dig into Colombia from an internal perspective. Colombia is obviously undergoing not just a physical, but an extraordinary political transformation. And we will discuss the 2026 presidential election, the rise of Abelardo Espriella, what his victory means for the country, especially after Gustavo Petro, and Colombia's dramatic realignment towards Washington and Israel. We'll also look at the devastating 7.4 magnitude earthquake that struck Colombia on August 10th, killing hundreds and leaving thousands injured and unhoused, and how the disaster has become the first major test of the new government. And finally, we will examine Colombia's rapidly renewed relationship with Israel, including the restoration of diplomatic ties, the new government's recognition of sovereignty over the Golan Heights, plans to move the embassy, and the arrival of Israeli assistance following the earthquake. And Joshua will give us some insight on the new security administration being enacted by the new regime. Welcome to the show, first time Joshua. Joshua, for you guys, he is a freelance journalist based in Colombia, spent years reporting across the global South, Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador, with the specific focus on political violence, armed conflict, migration, and Latin American politics. You can find his reporting on other outlets such as The New Humanitarian, Al Jazeera, Colombia Reports, and others. Welcome, Joshua, and thank you so much for joining me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I have so many questions.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. Well, first, I just want to give you a little bit of, and guys, while you're here, Colombia has great food, that they do. While you're here, please like and share the stream. But I want to give you a bit of time to kind of brag about yourself and tell us how. I saw you worked for Vice. You've had features on Al Jazeera and many large outlets. How did you wind up in South America and now in Colombia?
So in 2018, I came to Colombia because I wanted to get out of the United States and live in a place that was a Spanish-speaking country. And I had plans to do this whole tour of Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, Chile, and Argentina, and kind of like look around and pick a place. And I just never left Colombia. I mean, I've left, but I've never lived anywhere besides Colombia since then. So I just really fell in love with the country. And I ended up in Cúcuta, which is right on the Venezuelan border, in 2018, which was the height of the Venezuelan exodus. And one of the principal reasons that I was interested in journalism was because of migration across the Americas. And that's kind of how I got started. And at that time, I think there were maybe 3 or 4 English speakers in Cúcuta. So I had no experience or contacts, but I just started pitching and started doing a lot of trips into areas where conflict is still going on. Some of your listeners are probably aware the civil war officially here in 2016 when the government signed a peace deal with the FARC, but in reality, the conflict is still very much ongoing. So I kind of started in journalism by doing field reporting in a lot of those places, and then started writing for Vice and the London Times and a bunch of other outlets when the national strike started here. So that'd be 2019 and 2021. There were 2. The second one was huge. And I was doing a lot of street coverage of protests at the time. That's kind of really how I got started writing for more international outlets.
Well, so what made you fall in love with the country back in 2018? And we'll talk about it more, but has it changed drastically since then? We're 8 years later, you've been in Colombia.
It has, and it hasn't. I know that's kind of a cheap answer, but there are things that are very different. But I think that some things have not changed, and that's that most of the institutions here are pretty conservative, right-leaning. Conflict is still very much ongoing. We've had some changes, of course, with the 4 years of Colombia, with Petro. That was the first leftist president in modern history. So obviously that was a bit of a change, but you have to understand that while he was president, that all of the appointments from decades before, most of the judges, like all of the bureaucracy, they were all appointees from right governments. So while there was a lot of like rhetorical change, and I felt a little more comfortable as a journalist, I feel like really the root of how Colombia works did not really change that much, if that makes a little sense.
Yeah, so I mean, let's get into it. I loved Gustavo Petro as a person. I don't know a ton about his administration inside of Colombia, but he just seems like like such a sweet, kind-hearted person. One of our good friends, Dan, is actually, I think he still is, but was his lawyer for a while.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Nice.
what can you tell us about Gustavo Petro, like the guy, and then his administration?
When he was a student, he was jailed for participating in the guerrilla movement M19, which was like a sort of DEMSOC guerrilla movement, which is a strange guerrilla movement to be, but that's kind of what they were. And after that, he was a long-time activist and then a senator for decades. He was the former mayor of Bogota. Yeah, I mean, he's a DEMSOC. He's certainly left-wing from like a U.S. or European perspective, but for Colombia, it was very unusual. But I wouldn't say he was radically left from the perspective of the way that Latin American politics generally work. He was really focused on like raising the minimum wage. He was really focused on doing a lot more spending in areas that had long been neglected by the capital, Bogota, here. And he was also really invested in this plan to negotiate with armed groups in return for their disarmament, sort of like the way that the 2000 peace deal worked with the FARC. He had very mixed results on that. There were a few successes and a few terrible failures, and a few of them were self-inflicted, I think. I find him to be very entertaining and charming. His communications sometimes were a bit of a mess. Like regarding the peace plan, like they announced a unilateral ceasefire on New Year's Eve, like shortly after Petro took office, and almost all of that collapsed immediately. Most of them had not been even discussed with the armed groups that the government was mentioning. But I think they kind of learned from that error. And I've read, if you read kind of center-right analysis of total peace, they'll say total peace was a failure. I don't think it was a failure. I think that there were some pretty clear successes, but there's undeniably some pretty big setbacks as well. And conflict has continued to grow. It's a trend that started under his predecessor, Ivan Duque. Ever since the peace deal was implemented in 2017, the government had all these promises that they were going to invest in all of these areas that have been long neglected, all of these conflict zones, and they just didn't. So Ivan Duque, like a right-wing president who came in immediately after the peace deal, actually won elections on dismantling it, and he drug his feet in every way that he could. Every legislative device, every presidential power that he had went to like not implementing what the government said they were going to do. So other armed groups moved into that power vacuum, and that trend continued under Petro, although he didn't start it. And that's still continuing now. And that was a huge issue in elections here.
Okay, well, you bring up elections. We covered them here kind of just as what happened, and then obviously Gustavo Petro alluded to some maybe interference, foreign funding at minimum. What can you tell us about the elections and how they went, sort of leading up to the election, and then we could talk about the aftermath?
Well, let's start with the bits of that accusation that are founded, very founded, and that's that the U.S. endorsed his opponent, Abril de la Espriella, who ended up winning the election. He's this ultra right-wing, sort of populist, kind of the new right in the vein of Trump or Milei or Bolsonaro. And you had senators here showing up to visit him during the campaign. There were multiple statements by sitting politicians in the US, which is highly unusual. I've been in Colombia almost a decade, and I've never seen anything like that before. So you definitely had some really overt lobbying by the United States in the election that I would describe as interference. I think that that's indisputable. Petro's claims that there were fraud are a little more complicated. I work with the editor of Colombia Reports. That's the oldest English language online newspaper here in Colombia. And we spent some time looking into the accusations, and some of them were unfounded. Like, for example, he claims that the digital custody chain, which like affects to like, I don't know, the way blockchain works or a watermark might work in a document, was compromised. But that seems to be an error on his part because the body here that publishes election results to the public doesn't use those watermarks. Those go to the official counters and to organizations that are overseeing the elections. I mean, I can get more into the nuts and bolts of it, but I think ultimately what it comes down to is that if you're going to make an accusation that strong, you need to back it up with really strong proof as well. Now, there were some questionable things, like some of the voter mesas, the tables, excuse me, I just slipped into Spanish, were strangely like non-organic. Like you'd see, so the way that it works in Colombia is you walk up and you have your ID, and then the end of your number of your ID determines which table you go to. So it's effectively random, right? Like for all purposes, like if you walk into a voting station, you don't know which mesa you're going to end up at. But there were like 10 voting precincts where like 1 through 5 were like 90% for Abelardo, and 5 through 10 were like 90% for Petro, which is really strange. Like that seems unlikely that that would happen. But we didn't find those kinds of discrepancies on a level that could have influenced elections. But ultimately, I think what it really comes down to that the bar he didn't quite clear and prove is that whatever digital manipulation there may or may not have been, those votes are physically counted by people in Bogota as part of the slow count, which goes on for 2-3 weeks, right? So manipulation of that kind of system is very difficult to do. Now, I'm not saying that there are no irregularities, and I'm not saying I have a completely closed mind about the accusations, but I think that he kind of failed to clear providing proof that would substantiate an allegation that is that serious.
Yeah. Well, tell me about what was the sentiment surrounding the election where people, how the pendulum kind of swings. You even said, well, Gustavo wasn't really far left. He's a Dem sock that's left of center in a normal world. And in the United States, it's probably a communist maniac, I guess.
Right,
what was the sentiment and the feeling and the vibe in Colombia? Did it seem like they wanted the pendulum to swing the other way? Would that be a sort of, could it make sense for Abelardo to be elected in this situation?
Well, I think that's part of what made a lot of people doubt the results is that, for one, Abelardo outperformed the polls. He was polling like 6 or 7% behind Cepeda at the end of the elections. But that happens in Latin America. Sometimes polls are not always accurate. I also think that if you're going to try to understand the Petro presidency, I really want to reiterate that point I said before, where it's like all of the machinery and the way that Colombia really works. You're talking about people that have had these jobs for decades. They were all appointed by really right-wing presidents and really traditional political parties that have formed like a core. And in Colombia, there's a lot of, how can I put this, collusion, I guess, let's say, between the really big media companies who are owned generally by a few wealthy families and that apparatus, that machinery. So they all got behind Espriella, right? And like, I think people that were Cepeda supporters hoped that popular will would override this machinery. But it's strong, like it's old. I think of it like the dinosaurs, like they're slow and they're not agile, but they're strong. They can stomp and they have force, right? And that's kind of what the machinery behind Espriella was. And he's kind of changed the right from what it was here into something different. I guess we'll see what happens. But I can understand completely why people didn't trust the election results. And then to make it worse, he only won by a little more than 200,000 votes, which is less than 1% of the balloting, right? So there was a lot of room there for people to doubt those results. And I understand why people would doubt what the Colombian state says 100%.
Tell me about the new president. I mean, I did a little bit of research into his background and was like, whoa.
Yeah. Hablar de la Estrella. So he's a former defense attorney. That's how he made his money. He's a millionaire. And he represented narco traffickers and paramilitaries here. He also has some really close ties to some very controversial paramilitary figures here in Colombia. So he ran a foundation that effectively did public relations for the AUC. The AUC were a paramilitary defense squad that operated during Colombia's civil war that committed grave human rights violations. It's not an exaggeration to say that they were a death squad. They were directly involved in the false positives cases here in Colombia. The false positives were these, I think it's 1,700 cases where the government killed civilians and then claimed that they were FARC fighters in order to inflate casualty statistics during the Civil War. That's just one of many, many, many horrible stories I could tell you about the AUC. And this is who Espriella started his career in politics working with. I wouldn't say for, because he was hired to sort of represent them, to like give them a good public face, and that's where he comes from. And that's from there he went into representing a lot of different narco dealers. There was a point where he represented Alex Saab on money laundering charges, the Venezuelan minister. He also worked a lot in Miami, representing people in the U.S. justice system as well. And so he's just this really kind of has this really shady background, but he also has this interesting public persona. He's really short, but he's like he's perfectly groomed. Like, you know, he's got the line beard and gets a haircut every day, and and he ran this campaign that was sort of populist, although super right wing. So he combined a lot of really generic kind of anti-woke. You know, this is like a phrase you hear a lot among right-wing politicians these days, like, oh, woke, woke, woke. And he really incorporated a lot of like traditional gender roles. And I say that in the sense that, so machismo is a thing in Latin America, right? Unfortunately. And he really leaned into that. So there was a lot of like really derogative comments about women. He had a couple scandals because he was insulting one of the other right-wing candidates' vice presidents in the primary, who happens to be gay. And there was a lot of just like really leaning into that kind of non-politically correct, but I'm a man and I'm just joking. If you can't take it, that's your fault. As well as this really violent, what I would call kind of like modern fascist rhetoric of like ultra nationalism. Like his campaign, one of the slogans was the firme por la patria, like strong for the motherland or the country, and really leaned into this idea of an internal threat that like leftists at one point he said needed to be disemboweled. He really leaned into a lot of some of the armed groups that are still operating or still exist here in Colombia, and really leaned into calling Petro a communist and Cepeda a communist. Cepeda is not a communist, which is like kind of funny, like just by definition of what communism means. Like he has on his website, he had this 30-page platform on what he called like fair capitalism, right? So that's clearly not a communist, but just really leaning into that rhetoric. And in some ways it was kind of a throwback to the way that Colombia used to work during the Civil War. Anything leftist was vilified, because if you were leftist, that meant that you were a guerrilla terrorist, right? And he really is kind of like bringing back some of that rhetoric, but along with some weird economic populism. Like, for example, he sort of vaguely promised to raise minimum wage. He sort of vaguely promised to bring the age when you qualify for pensions up. You know, whether he's going to keep those promises or not, I have no idea. Like, a lot of his campaign platform was really vague, but it seems to have resonated enough to have won. And I think another thing to understand about those elections is that like liberals here are the center right here. They don't like him, but they probably dislike Cepeda more. And I think that's one of the factors in why he won as well.
Well, so let's get into his presidency. pretty, we'll just talk about the earthquake first, because that occurred basically immediately following his inauguration. And you sent us a clip of his first press conference after the earthquake. But before we get to that, tell me about, you were there. What was it like? I mean, we've seen Venezuela had their own set of sister earthquakes, devastating. And then we see Colombia get hit with their own. And what was that like to be in country?
Well, I'm at the moment I'm in Medellin. We felt the earthquake here, but there was very little structural damage. So my experiences on the earthquake are not going to compare to someone's in Chocos or Quibdó or Cali or Pereira. But I mean, even here in Medellin, like they evacuated our building. I went out into the streets. There's thousands. I live in downtown. There's thousands and thousands of people in the streets. Some of them in their pajamas, holding their dogs. Like it was an event here, but far worse. Far worse. It was the epicenter was in Choco, which is on the Pacific coast. That's a area that is been incredibly neglected by the state. There's very few roads. A lot of the towns that were affected still don't have power or communications. Transport's arriving by river or by air. So yeah, 300 deaths, 3,000 missing, and I just saw the statistics before I came on here today about the damages. So the Unidad Nacional para la Gestión de Riesgo de Desastres, that's the National Unit for Risk and Management of Disasters in Colombia, the government agency that's like disaster response. They estimate that 130,000 homes are damaged or destroyed, and 285 health centers, 2,838 educational facilities. And they also state that because so many of these small towns in Choco are still not connected, like they're not reliable information, that both the death toll and the structural toll is expected to rise considerably over the next days and weeks.
Well, I think that obviously the earthquake itself was devastating, but the real story was the political aftermath or reaction or lack thereof. So I'll play this clip. This is Abelardo's first press conference following the earthquake.
¿Pronunciamiento del presidente?
Ana Milena, muy buenas tardes. Sí, señora, en este momento se está ubicando el presidente de la República, Abelardo de la Espriella, con parte de su gabinete. Lo acompaña el vicepresidente José Manuel Restrepo, el ministro.
So as you guys can see, he's there blowing kisses. You said it was surreal. What
it was. So yeah, after I went back into my building, they cleared it. I started looking around for what had happened, and devastating reports started pouring in immediately. So Espriella in the beginning didn't say anything, and then 2 hours later, he releases a really brief video of him on his private jet, like having a nice drink, and I was like, that is not the image you want to be presenting right now, man. Like, this is a tragedy. And then what you just played was his first public press conference where he's blowing kisses and waving to people. And I just really think that it's just a fundamental failure to sort of understand the gravity of the situation. Like, I think that when people are confronting tragedy and shock and horror, like that's not what they're looking for from someone who's the head of state. So that was just really getting his foot off on the wrong foot, getting off on the wrong foot immediately. But those problems were compounded. So because Petro raised those accusations about vote fraud, De La Espriella canceled the transition of power. It was his decision to do so. Usually, there will be like a 30 to 50-day process that starts before the president assumes power and ends up after, where the outgoing administration will coordinate with all of their incoming replacements, because an administration is big. You're talking about the cabinet, all the sub-officials, all the ministries, and everyone they want to appoint, and they get to appoint thousands of people, right? So usually there's cooperation between the two governments when there's a transition of power in Colombia. Espriella decided just to not do that. So when the earthquake struck, he had not appointed anyone to the disaster response organization, the government response that's in charge of responding to these disasters. And so for the first day, you had Petro people working for free because they were like, well, we can't leave. Like, this is crazy, right? And so like he just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And then I sent you another clip of him. He showed up in, I believe the clip is from Buenaventura on the Pacific coast as well. And he's like handing out these footballs, soccer balls, whichever word you want to use, to people. And these are people that have like lost their homes. They aren't sure where their next meal is coming from. And he just keeps doing all these really tone deaf actions that are, I think, is really starting to infuriate people.
He really reminds me of Trump. I posted on our account the photo of Trump throwing the paper towels to the hurricane survivors in Puerto Rico. And I was like, that's the first thing that came to my mind. And we were just discussing in the chat a little bit. And just as a side note, people, Brad Parscale who was paid by Israel, by the way, through a shell company in Germany. He was a key strategic consultant for the political campaign of De La Espriella. So, and that's Trump's campaign manager from 2016, and he's the former digital director for Donald Trump and campaign manager. So the parallels are very, very intriguing. I mean, and they also remind me of Milei a bit, but this guy reminds me much more of Trump than Milei ever did.
I can see why that came to your mind. I mean, that makes sense to me. And there are some similarities, right? He's kind of moved away from the traditional sort of neoliberal right-wing parties that have run Colombia for so long. Like, he doesn't talk in terms of austerity. Like, he doesn't talk really in terms of having much of an ideology. I mean, his ideology is him, right? His ideology is like, I need to have more power, right? So that I can fix the problem. Like, so, and I think Trump is kind of similar. Like, Trump contradicts himself all the time. I don't know what that man's ideology is, other than something I can't say probably live on the air. Like, but they're similar in that respect. Like, their ideology is what they believe in that moment. Their ideology is their self-interest, perhaps, is the best way to put it.
Yeah, I find people like this so fascinating, I think, because I struggle to understand them. So it's like one of those things where I'm like, I can't look away. This is just so curious to me. And okay, so you mentioned we talked about the response and lack thereof, and you sent me this photo, and you said this is the housing minister at a resort. Is this a housing minister that Espriella appointed for his administration, or is this a leftover from Gustavo Petro's time?
It's a little confusing because it's the Ministerio de Haciendas, which sounds like the housing minister, but it's the finance minister. Is a better way to translate it. It's not incorrect, but anyway, yeah, Miguel Gomez Martinez. So these photos have surfaced over the last couple of days. I think they started surfacing 3 days ago. This is the guy that's going to be in charge of planning earthquake relief, right? So he's been on the job like a week, and he's on vacation on the beach with his family in Santa Marta. And this is just another example of Espriella's entire team just really putting forth some really boneheaded, just the unforced errors, I guess is the way to put it. Like, why is that guy on vacation? Not only is the country facing a large scale tragedy, but he just got the job. And we just talked about how the transition has been a nightmare because Espriella kneecapped it, right? So I don't know. It would seem to me like this guy has a lot that he should be doing, but I guess he wants to have a beer on the beach. Who am I to judge that?
We all want to have beers on the beach, but there's
on the beach.
thousands of Colombians trapped under the rubble. And just as a juxtaposition, guys, this is how many Colombians are still forced to live. So not some of them aren't even tents; they're just sort of like signage and tarps.
I believe that footage is from Pereira, which is like in central. I believe that footage is from Pereira, which is one of the cities that was most affected. It's kind of like central west Colombia, and well, state response has been extremely lacking. But it's been really heartening, much like we saw in Venezuela. The civil response to this disaster has been amazing. I mean, that video really illustrates that there's no temporary refuge being set up in stadiums or gymnasiums by the state. So you have a lot of people that are in really dire circumstances. But the community response has been really amazing. I mean, I was talking this morning with this group of Venezuelans who organized aid deliveries during the earthquakes there. And when the earthquakes happened here, they realized that they already had all the logistics networks. So they immediately started shipping tons, literally tons of aid to Chocó, one of the most hard hit regions. They have people on the ground in Quibdó right now. And what I'm seeing from reports from those places is the donations from civil society have been just really incredible. And you've seen this kind of like self-organization. Now, what's interesting to me about this self-organization is that all of the places that were really hard hit by the earthquake are also, by coincidence, the places that were the most active during the national strike here in 2021. So the response from civil society is being formed through organizations that either participated or were formed because of the national strike. So what you see is organization within the communities that is responding to this disaster. And to me, this is really hopeful. As horrible as the tragedy is, the fact that organization is what is allowing those civil organizations and civic society to respond so aptly to these needs is a hopeful sign. And I think that it's a scary sign for Espriella. Like, he doesn't want to see that. He doesn't want people in Chocó, Pereira, and Cali to even think about trying something like the national strike again. That is his nightmare, right? Like that's what made Duque, Petro's predecessor, into effectively a lame duck president. There was a national uprising against him. And it's really early in his administration, so I don't want to make any predictions. But I do feel comfortable saying that if he continues making so many horrible mistakes, that's what's going to happen. Those structures still exist.
Let's take a look. You provided this video, and we need a bit of a pick me up, a little bit of good energy. So here's a video of one of the distribution networks, and Joshua will tell us about it after. I love that video. That's why I played the whole thing.
No, it's great. Yeah, those guys are amazing. So
that's what I love about like Latin and South America. Just the people are just incredible. Tell us what were they? Tell us about the group.
Yeah,
and then
what that's in Quibdó. So that's actually filmed by one of my friends and contact as well, the guy that I mentioned, part of this Venezuelan group that's now providing aid to Quibdó. But what they realized when they got to Quibdó is they don't know Quibdó. So they started working with local organizations, which I think is the smartest thing you can possibly do, because they're the ones who know the needs of the community and they know the logistics of the city and they know how it works, right? So those guys are a coalition. They informally call themselves Los Bastardos. Now, like, you won't find like that website that says that. It's just sort of like the leftover children of all the different civil groups, right, is where it comes from, the bastards. But they're amazing because they show up in those big flatbed trucks they were all cheering in, right? And they drive to a sector of the city, followed by like 20 guys on motorcycles. They park, and then all the guys on motos know the neighborhood, right? Like they know, like, oh, we need to take this to my abuela up the street, and then Juanita, she's half blind around the corner. We need to make sure we get it to her as well. And the guys in the motos are the distribution network, right? They take from the truck to all the different points, and they're amazing. Like they just get it done, and then they go back to the airport to pick up more. They've been doing this for 5 days now, 6 days now, and yeah, and like their chants, they were saying a lot of stuff. But one of the things that I thought was really cool is the guy was like, "Why are we here?" And they're like, "Para servir, to serve." And they're like, "But what do we want to do?" And they're like, "To serve." But I love how that like outdoor, that like self-organization is so joyful and so beautiful, right?
Yeah, you see a lot of that. We saw it when we were in Iran as well, this sort of understanding of kind of supporting each other and fulfilling the needs. They have a concept in Iran that nobody can go without, and that seems kind of a common thread throughout the global South. This sort of, if I have and you don't, then we both have.
Yeah.
And maybe it's communism, right? These dirty commies, right? I want to go back to Espriella and the stuff that obviously has caused a lot of people to raise their eyebrows a bit, was that immediate recognition of the Golan Heights and this sort of resurgence of ties with Israel after Gustavo Petro was one of the most outspoken critics against the genocide in Palestine. When did Colombia sever ties with Israel? And how is that just a kind of a Gustavo Petro initiative, or do the people inside of Colombia, are they anti-Zionist project?
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. I'm gonna start with who cut diplomatic ties with Israel, and that was Petro. Petro was one of the first world leaders to call what was happening in Gaza a genocide, and he received a lot of criticism for it in the beginning. But I think that time has proven him correct, right? So he's the one that severed digital diplomatic contacts with Israel. Israel has a long and complicated history in Colombia. How can I put this? So Israel has often functioned as sort of the arms dealer for the US in a lot of Latin American countries. Like if there's a place where there's a lot of human rights violations going on that the US wants armed, they'll often use intermediaries from the private sector in Israel to arm those actors. And Israel, to this day, and during the Petro administration, armed Colombia's military. All of the firearms, all of the small arms. Petro did stop buying jets from them, but that was almost a purely symbolic gesture because Colombia's jets are the Kafir jets made by Israel, and the ones that they are in service now are 15 years old. So they were going to be decommissioned anyway relatively soon. But if you look at photos of the Colombian military, you'll notice that they have Israeli rifles, they have Israeli sidearms, and this is still the case, right? Like, so I don't want to overstate the influence, though, that Israel has on the current government. I think it's more that the U.S. has influence on the current government, and them throwing out a couple of symbolic gestures is just really just a tip of the hat to people like Marco Rubio and Trump that, like, look, like, we're on your side, like, we're doing what you want. So I think it's more subservience to the U.S. than it is subservience to Israel. I get that's a complicated issue. We can talk about that all well. But so that's the answer to that question. Are people in Colombia generally anti-Zionist? I would say any sort of progressive or left-wing movement definitely is. The right is a little more complicated. I think it's kind of mixed. Espriella certainly is. Yeah, but I think that what he's more about is trying to signal to Washington that he's their guy. He wants to be the next Daniel Noboa in Ecuador. He wants to be the next place where he welcomes the U.S. military in to conduct security missions. He wants to be the next place that is first in line every time Trump has some kind of security demand. He wants to blow up some boats, we'll blow up some boats. I think that's his primary objective.
Well, how do we talk about this sort of You mentioned the arms dealing. Well, that made me think of Keiko Fujimori. Her and her father were big Israeli arms dealers and traffickers, and she's been just recently elected in Peru in another razor thin election. And we are kind of seeing this domino effect of, we'll call them pro-American. I mean, at this point, America and Israel are one and the same, and they're joining their militaries at the end of the year, merging them together. But so we've seen this sort of domino effect, you know, outside of Milei, who we could talk about him a little bit later, but we've seen
he's
Chile.
He's kind of the outlier, right? He's the one who is clearly is super pro-Israel. Like that's one of his.
Yeah. He's ideologically pro-Israel.
Right,
I don't necessarily think the rest of these people are ideologically pro-Israel. Like Chile, he obviously does it out of a political obligation. You know, we had the domino fall in Venezuela with the disaster kidnapping of Maduro. You mentioned Ecuador. We have Peru, Costa Rica, Honduras. This is a very, very fast-moving sort of steamroller. And what do you think about that as kind of holistically? And we've covered the Isaac Accords in depth, which is just the Abraham Accords on steroids and for South America. What do you think about all of that?
I think that, I mean, of course, like whatever word you want to put on that, I think people are kind of struggling to come up with a phrase as catchy as the pink wave or whatever. But whatever you want to call this regional trend towards the right in a lot of recent elections, there are some common threads, but I think that there's also, you kind of have to look at each country in its own context as well. And I think one of the things that maybe it's important for people who don't live here in Colombia understand is that when Petro started his total peace plan, I work in some of these areas that are affected by conflict, and there was a lot of hope. There was a lot of hope that things would be different because they had suffered 60 years of these kinds of military measures that often killed civilians. And there was hope that, okay, well, maybe the government is going to like pull it off this time. And this is hard for people who live in these communities to trust the government because they've been lied to by the government so many times. And so I think, like I said in the beginning, the mixed results from Petro frustrated a lot of people because in a lot of those conflict zones, material conditions didn't improve, security didn't improve. And I think there's a lot of frustration there. So I don't think that those people necessarily voted for De La Espriella, but if you live in a really rural area and you went and traveled for 4 hours to go vote for Petro when he ran, and then you lived through his sort of, from your perspective, like no improvements, are you really going to do that again for De La Espriella? Do you understand what I'm saying? I think that there was just like a depressed turnout in those regions, although they certainly wouldn't support like what De La Espriella stands for. Well, most of them. Norte de Santander on the border is kind of an exception.
One of our audience members was asking questions about the FARC. What can you tell us about the FARC and sort of these other parties, groups inside of Colombia?
Yeah, well, I covered armed groups a lot. I run like a small media collective here called Pirate Wire Services. And if you're interested in really in-depth coverage of armed groups, that's a good place to look. It's piratewireservices.com. But the short story is, in 2016, Colombia signed the peace deal with the FARC. And then in 2017, it was implemented. FARC disarmed en masse. The vast majority of the FARC disarmed and either directly rejoined civil society or went to live in transition communities while they sort of learned to readapt to not being a guerrilla anymore. And then in these little communities were called ZOOTs. They're like temporary location zones. And they would be provided with carpentry training or whatever else. If they were interested in something, the government was supposed to give them vocational training in order to do that. And in some places they did. But for the most part, the government did not live up to all of the obligations that they had promised these FARC fighters. So now, some FARC dissident groups, they still call themselves FARC, the terminology here gets really confusing really fast, but I'll try to be simple, didn't acknowledge the peace deal. And so they stayed in the countryside and stayed at war with the state. Others when they realized the government was not living up to their promises, they abandoned the peace process and picked up arms again and then went to war again against the state. But the problem, though, is that there is no longer a central command. So you had this splitting and fracturization of FARC forces that became a number of different ones. So we could talk a lot about that, but the important thing to understand is that there are basically three big ones right now, and they fight with each other sometimes, and they also fight with the ELN. The ELN is a very different beast. That's the National Liberation Army. They're a liberation theology Marxist guerrilla group, so they're very Catholic, very religious. And they never operated like the FARC. They're very different. They never thought they could beat the state in open conflict. They never looked for battles with the state. Instead, they sort of hold territory, and there's this little, they're like this autonomous regions of Colombia. They're kind of run by them, and they're also fighting with the FARC dissident groups. So there's infighting among all those groups. And right now, the biggest armed group in Colombia is the EGC, the Gaitanista Army of Colombia. The Western media often calls them the Gulf Clan, and they are sort of ideological descendants of the paramilitary forces that fought on the side of the government during the Civil War. And they're also the biggest traffickers internally. Like, they have all the distribution networks that move all the cocaine to the coast where it's sold, right? So the EGC is the fastest growing and the biggest armed group. The three biggest FARC groups are still pretty large, and then ELN is the second largest group right now. But all of those groups are all fighting with each other as well as the state. So that gets messy quick. And Espriella thinks that he can solve this problem by doing what governments in Colombia have done for 6 decades, which is bomb the jungle, I guess. He thinks it's going to work this time, but that comes in Colombia with a history of very dangerous human rights violations and attacks on civil society that have often veered into not only attacking security actors, but attacking civil society, criminalizing dissent, and criminalizing that dissent in a violent way. And that's what I'm worried about his security policy coming in, because that's what Trump and Rubio want in Latin America. They want the iron fist. They want bombings. They want huts in the jungle being blown up, boats being drone attacked, and people being assassinated. And when that starts happening in Colombia, historically, that has had tragic and devastating results on anybody who is left of Henry Kissinger.
So we joked, well, I shouldn't say joked, but we kind of started calling it the whole entire network between Ecuador, with the U.S. already bombed them. And wasn't there a bombing inside of Colombia somewhere as well?
There was a bombing on the Ecuadorian-Colombian border, and a bomb bounced into Colombia, according to the Ecuadorian army. I think everybody knows bombs don't bounce, but that was the polite way to not make a big international issue out of it, I think, and Petro kind of let them do it. Let them get away with the faux pas. As far as I know, the U.S. has not carried out bombings in Colombia. They've bombed boats just off the coast of Colombia. They've killed Colombian fishermen. We have stories about that. But I think we're going to start to see operations in Colombia, like in the way that we see them in Ecuador. Like, what was it that the Times and the Washington Post last week came out with a story that suggests that a boat strike on Ecuadorian, just off the coast of Ecuador, that killed fishermen was actually organized by the CIA and probably carried out by private military contractors acting as actors for the CIA. So I think we're going to start to see stuff like that. Or in Mexico, the CIA has now openly admitted to killing 2 narco traffickers. This is really a break from the way that, well, at least in recent history, the CIA has worked. I don't mean that the CIA was not violent before. Clearly they were, but they didn't go talk to the newspapers about it, right? This is something that's like new with Trump. It's almost like the fear and the intimidation is part of his strategy, if he has one. But I think we're going to start seeing very similar things in Colombia very soon.
What about the network that is sort of forming in that crescent. We talked about Honduras Gate on our show, which obviously Juan Orlando Hernandez was pardoned by Trump. He's a huge cocaine trafficker. Ochoa in Ecuador, they run the ports and they've been known to traffic cocaine. And now we have, Espriella is at least, they're arguably he's might be partying a little bit too, but at least we know that for fact he defended narco. It's like, I'll kill the narco terrorists that aren't my friends. How dark does this get? Like, how is this? I mean, even at face value, it looks pretty wicked.
I mean, I'm not super comfortable making predictions. I think I kind of expressed my fears about what might happen. I think I would just point out that, like, in the past, basically up until Colombia's national strike, which is one of the factors that was why Petro won office, is that this was a wildly popular national strike. In the beginning, the first month, it had like a 70% approval rating, which is unheard of, right? And the state response was we're just going to murder people, which they did. They killed, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think it was like 60 something protesters in the course of a month. And this caused like a popular rebellion against the state and these right wingers who were so confident because they've been running the country for so long, right? So, but that's how Colombia historically thinks about dissent. Like, oh, you're organizing a march. Like, what are you, like a guerrilla? Like, you're a terrorist. So they use this to criminalize like any sort of dissent up until they've criminalized entire parties. Like, so. Before Duque, before Uribe, who's very famous for his war crimes, the government basically decided that the Communist Party here, Unión Patriótica was the name of the party, that they were communists, and they murdered them. They murdered like 60% of the people, and then like everyone else fled the country. So, I mean, when Colombia decides that they're going to go after this sort of like internal enemy, like this phrase they keep using, this is the phrase you hear, like that quickly becomes very difficult to distinguish between civil society and whatever it is they're talking about, right? I don't have a very clear idea what they mean by that, but it in practice quickly becomes anyone who disagrees with me. And now I'm not predicting that's what's going to happen in Colombia, but that's the fear, right? That's the history that this country has, and this country has seen it before. And I mean, I remember during the Paro, like getting beat by police all the time. They didn't care that I was press. Like they didn't give a shit, right? Like, and I think that at the very least we might see a return to those sort of norms, right? He's already militarized Cali as part of his earthquake response. I don't think that serves any purpose. He doesn't know what else to do. He's like, we'll just put soldiers on the streets. That'll solve something, I guess. Like that's just kind of his approach to everything, right? But the military is not a perfect tool for every situation. It's kind of dangerous to insert them into situations where they're confronting protesters, for example. But this is kind of how he thinks, right? Every problem needs to be solved by force. He wanted to have his inauguration at a military base. Basically, Petro wouldn't allow it. It was like one of his last, he had to like certify where it was going to be. And he's like, no, you're not gonna take the presidency at a military base. So it was like rescheduled. But this is an example of like how this guy thinks. And if you watch his acceptance speech, like he's on this big stage and this very Orwellian, there's a lot of like fascist imagery and this like colored lights behind him, and he's just talking. It seems like a satire of like a bad science fiction movie about why you should be scared of the future. But this guy thinks it's cool, right? He's like, I'm like, what's going on? Like, you know.
So what do you think is? Oh, you don't. I know you don't like predicting, but well, what does I mean? Are we looking at like Operation Condor 2.0? How? I have a lot of. I worry a great deal after obviously they had been trying to coup Bolivia for years. Then Milei comes into office, and then we have this devastating kidnapping of Maduro, which. Who even knows where he is at this point, and Celia, and then it just kind of kept on going from there. And I have maybe I'm paranoid or a little bit of a drama queen like Gustavo Petro, but I worry about people like Marco Rubio having this much control and then possibly running again and running in 2028. And he probably would win if he did run. This is his project, the new Don Roe doctrine, the Gulf of America, even though that's kind of hokey and stupid. But like, what is the outlook like? It just doesn't, I don't get very good vibes, sadly.
No, I mean, I agree. I think that it's pretty clear what the U.S. wants to happen. They've effectively made Venezuela into a protectorate, right? España is all too happy to sort of serve that role, if not exactly under the same amount of pressure or threat, not exactly as a protectorate, but as sort of like a neo-colony, right? He's very clear about that. He's like, we'll do what you want in return. Like, you need to help me out with my agenda. And this is a change. This is the kind of language that people like Trump and Rubio understand. It's like they're pushing for their goals. And it's a very overt and violent trend that this administration in the United States is carrying on. And it's a throwback to like the Cold War, right? Obviously, there are some differences, but I think the general parallels are all there. The U.S. wants to project its power forcefully into Latin America and the Caribbean. So that's what they're doing, and they're doing so without shame. Does that scare me? Of course it does. I don't think many people in Latin America aren't scared by that, right? Like, I guess some people feel like if they're part of a moneyed class that they're kind of sheltered from some of the violence that might bring. I don't feel like I'm part of that community as a journalist.
No, we're not supposed to be. I want to give you some time to give us any of your final thoughts, and please plug your website again and tell our viewers where they can find you, where you'd like them to find you.
I think that there's a lot to be nervous about in Colombia and the region, as you point out. And I think that we don't know the full extent of violent U.S. actions in Ecuador, for example. Like, that boat strike was from March, and we're just finding out some of the details now. I can't imagine what else has happened. And the same with Mexico. In these places that have sort of agreed to work with the U.S., there's a lot going on, and we don't know the full ramifications or the full scope of what is happening there. And that's something that I think that a lot of journalists across the entire region are going to be paying a lot of attention to in the coming months and years. But I want to circle back to my final thought being that there is a resistance here, and there's a resistance in Ecuador, and there's a resistance in Mexico. Like, this resistance is strong, and these resistances have endured dictatorships. They have endured death squads. They have endured things that most Americans in the US could not even imagine. And they're here, and these networks exist, and they are around right now. And although they might not be powerful resources, they have toppled presidents, and that exists here. So that gives me some hope, like what we saw from the guys delivering earthquake aid in Quibdó. I think that's really cool. But yeah, as for what I do, I'm a freelance journalist. I also run, or help run more accurately, a media collective called Pirate Wire Services. You can find that on piratewireservices.com.
Well, thank you. I would have to have you on again, because obviously things are going to continue to tumble in Colombia for the foreseeable future. I really enjoyed this conversation. I'd love to pick your brain about more areas in the region. So thank you, Joshua, for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
And it was a fantastic conversation. And guys, we will see you again. I'm maybe on Thursday. I'm still kind of in transit, but definitely on Sunday. And take care. And once again, thank you, Joshua, for joining us.
Thank you very much.